Hello there everyone. Tonight's story takes us back to a time when people truly believed that taking a simple bath could invite death itself, an age when fear and superstition shaped medicine and life alike. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. And don't forget to write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a quiet fan for that gentle hum in the background, and let's journey together into the night. I write this now in my 73rd year, when the world has turned itself over thrice since those days I shall recount. My hand trembles not from age alone, but from the weight of memory, from recalling a time when the simplest of acts, the washing of one's flesh, was believed to invite the final rest itself. Would you have feared the simple act of a bath? I pose this question not in jest, but in earnest contemplation. For there was a time, and not so distant as one might suppose, when the answer amongst learned men and common folk alike would have been a resounding affirmation. Yes, they would say, water upon the skin is dangerous. Yes, the opening of the pores invites the unseen visitor. Yes, to immerse oneself is to court the passing. I was born in the year 1643, in Lyon, that ancient city of rivers and stone, where the Rhône and Saône meet in perpetual embrace. My father was a physician of some modest repute, trained in the traditional manner at Montpellier, where the texts of Galen were still held as sacred scripture, as immutable as the words of the apostles themselves. From my earliest years, I was destined to follow his path, to learn the humours, the temperaments, the delicate balance that supposedly governed all human health. But I learned something else as well, something that would haunt me through all my years of practice. I learned to fear water. Not water in all its forms, you understand. We drank it, though mixed with wine when possible, for pure water was thought treacherous. We used it to cook, to wash our linens, to baptize the newly born. But water upon the body, water that touched the skin for any length of time, water warm enough to open those invisible gates we called pores, this was another matter entirely. My father spoke of it often, his voice taking on that particular tone of grave authority he reserved for the most dangerous of subjects. The body, he would say, is a fortress. The skin, its walls, and the pores are gates that must remain closed against the enemies without. What enemies? I asked him once when I was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. The corrupted air, he replied, the miasmas that carry affliction, the evil humours that float upon the wind, seeking entrance to the body's interior. A man clean-shaven and scrubbed is a man with his gates flung wide, inviting disaster. I believed him. Why would I not? He was my father, a learned man, and all around me the evidence seemed to support his claims. The year I turned 16, the affliction came to Lyon. We did not call it plague. That word was too terrible, too final, and it brought with it quarantine and all the economic ruin that such measures entailed. Instead we called it the unseen visitor, the autumn malady, the affliction of the lungs. But we knew what it was. Everyone knew. I remember the smell of that autumn. It began with the usual scents of the season, ripening grapes, wood smoke, the earthy dampness of falling leaves. But gradually, other odours intruded. Incense, burned in enormous quantities in every church and many homes, meant to purify the air. Vinegar splashed on doorsteps and windowsills. Herbs, rosemary, lavender, wormwood, hung in bunches from every lintel. And underneath it all, faint but growing stronger, the sweet, sick smell of the passing itself. My father's practice increased tenfold. He was called to houses throughout the city, from the finest homes along the river to the cramped dwellings of the tanners and dyers in the old quarter. I accompanied him on many of these visits, carrying his bag, observing, learning. It was in these months that I first truly understood the depth of our fear of water. I remember a wealthy merchant, a man named Fourier, who had made his fortune in silk. His house stood 3 stories tall, with glass in every window and Turkish carpets upon the floors. When we arrived, his wife met us at the door, her face pale above a pomander she held pressed to her nose. "He took a bath," she whispered, as though confessing to murder. 3 weeks ago. I told him it was folly, told him the weather was turning cold, told him his pores would open and admit the affliction. But he would not listen. He said he had seen Italian noblemen bathe regularly without ill effect. He said the old ways were superstition. She led us up the stairs to a bedchamber where Monsieur Fourier lay upon a bed that had clearly cost more than my father earned in a year. He was fevered, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his skin marked with the telltale signs we all dreaded. My father examined him with a careful distance that prudence demanded. He did not touch the man's skin directly, but used a cloth. He peered at his tongue, observed the colour of his eyes, sniffed discreetly at the air around the sick bed. "When did he take this bath?" my father asked. "The 14th of September, the wife replied with precision. "I remember because it was the Feast of the Holy Cross, and I thought it a particular blasphemy to indulge in such vanity on a holy day." My father nodded slowly. "And the symptoms began?" 5 days later. First a headache, then the fever, then... She gestured helplessly at her husband's prostrate form. I watched my father's face. He believed, absolutely and without question, that the bath had caused this man's affliction. The timing seemed to confirm it. The opened pores had admitted the corrupted air, the miasmas that carried sickness. It was as clear as any demonstration in geometry. "There is little to be done now," my father said quietly. "The gates have been breached. We must attempt to restore the balance of humours, to cool the fever without further opening the body to invasion. I shall prepare a decoction of willow bark and elderflower. He must drink it, but he must not sweat excessively, for that too opens the pores. Keep him warm, but not hot. Give him broth, but no wine. And above all..." He paused, looking directly at the wife. "No more water upon the skin, not a drop. Not until he has either recovered or..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Monsieur Fourier died 6 days later. His passing was recorded in the parish register, and though the cause was officially listed as autumnal fever, everyone who knew the circumstances understood the truth. He had bathed, and the bath had ended his life's journey. Could you imagine a time when to cleanse yourself might be seen as a final sentence? But it was not imagination. It was the world I inhabited, as real as stone and bread. Lyon had once been famous for its bathhouses. Old men spoke of the time, 2 centuries past, when there had been public baths throughout the city, when people had gathered in warm water to wash and socialize, when cleanliness had been thought next to godliness rather than next to the grave. But those days had ended. The great affliction of the 14th century, the one we dared not name, had changed everything. It had swept across Europe like a dark tide, taking perhaps a third of all souls, and in its wake had left a terror that persisted for generations, and among the many things blamed for its spread were the public baths. The reasoning seemed sound enough. Crowds gathered in warm, moist places, their pores opened wide, breathing the same corrupted air. How could affliction not spread in such circumstances? The bathhouses, once centres of community life, had been shut down one by one. By the time of my youth only a handful remained, and these were regarded with deep suspicion. Yet they persisted, these bathhouses, shadowy and furtive. There were still those who sought them out, the very poor, who had no means to maintain themselves otherwise, foreigners, particularly Germans and Italians, who came from lands where bathing had not entirely fallen from favour, and certain women whose profession required at least the appearance of cleanliness. I first entered a bathhouse in my 19th year. It was not from desire, I must emphasize, but from duty. My father had been called to attend a woman who had been injured in such an establishment, and as his apprentice, I accompanied him. The bathhouse stood in one of the city's oldest quarters, down a narrow lane that twisted between buildings that seemed to lean inward, as if sharing secrets. No sign marked the place. Those who sought it knew where to find it. The door was thick oak, reinforced with iron, and it opened to my father's knock only after considerable scrutiny through a small grille. Inside, the air struck me immediately. It was warm, almost stifling, and thick with moisture. The smell was complex, lavender and rosemary, yes, but also the unmistakable scent of many bodies in close quarters, of water that had bathed too many, of steam and stone, and something else I could not quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or shame. A woman met us in the entrance, a matron of perhaps 50 years, her face reddened from the constant heat, her dress simple but clean. She spoke in low tones to my father, explaining the situation. A girl, new to the establishment, had slipped on the wet stones and struck her head. She was conscious but bleeding. We were led through a series of corridors dimly lit by oil lamps that hung from hooks in the ceiling. Through open doorways I caught glimpses of the bathing rooms themselves. Wooden tubs, some large enough for 4 or 5 people, filled with water that sent up wisps of steam. Figures moved through the mist like ghosts, their forms indistinct. The sound of water was everywhere, dripping, splashing, the constant liquid murmur of a place whose very purpose was fluidity. The girl lay in a small room off the main chamber. She was perhaps 15, her hair wet and plastered to her skull, a cloth pressed to her forehead where blood had marked the trace left behind by her fall. She looked at us with wide, frightened eyes. My father examined her with his usual thoroughness, but I saw something else in his manner, a distaste, a disapproval that went beyond professional detachment. When he had finished cleaning and binding her wound, he turned to the matron. "She should leave this place," he said, "not merely for now, but permanently. The constant exposure to warm water, the opening of the pores, the breathing of corrupted air, these are invitations to affliction. That she has not yet succumbed is merely fortune, but fortune always turns." The matron's face hardened. And where should she go, learned doctor? Back to the streets, to starve? At least here she eats, has a roof, survives. Survival is not merely the continuation of breath, my father replied. Better a short life lived in accordance with natural law than a longer one spent in constant violation of it. I said nothing, but I looked at the girl, at her thin frame, at the fear in her eyes, and I wondered if my father's prescription was truly wise. But I was young, barely trained, and who was I to question the wisdom of generations? We left the bathhouse, emerging into the cold autumn air like divers surfacing from deep water. My father said nothing as we walked, but his silence was eloquent. That evening he spent an hour washing his hands and face with vinegar, scrubbing at his skin until it reddened, desperate to undo any corruption that might have attached itself to him in that place. I did the same, imitating his every action, feeling the vinegar sting my skin, and I felt a curious mixture of emotions, relief at being cleansed, fear at what we might have been exposed to, and something else, something I could not name. A sense of wrongness, perhaps, though I could not have said whether the wrongness lay in the bathhouse itself or in our reaction to it. In the spring of 1665, a physician arrived in Lyon from Padua. His name was Tommaso Guarini, and he brought with him ideas that seemed to us shocking, even heretical. I met him at a gathering of medical men, a small assembly convened to discuss a recent outbreak of fever in the southern districts. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with dark eyes and an intensity of manner that was distinctly foreign. He listened politely as the local physicians expounded their theories: corrupted air from the Tanner's Quarter, the unfavourable alignment of planets, the general moral laxity of the population. Then he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, his French accented but clear, "I mean no disrespect to your learning or experience. But I must tell you that in Italy we have begun to question many of these old assumptions, particularly regarding cleanliness and the body's health." A murmur ran through the room. My father, seated beside me, stiffened. Guarini continued, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the reaction he had provoked. "In Padua, I studied under men who had themselves studied with the great Fabricius, who taught Harvey. We have dissected bodies, not from ancient texts but actual cadavers, with our own eyes and hands, and what we have learned contradicts much of what Galen taught." "Galen," one of the older physicians interrupted, his voice sharp, "whose wisdom has guided medicine for 14 centuries. You propose to overturn his teaching based on a few dissections." "I propose nothing," Guarini replied calmly. "I merely report what we have observed. And one thing we have observed is that cleanliness, true cleanliness, including regular washing of the body, does not appear to increase susceptibility to affliction. Indeed, we have seen evidence to suggest the opposite." The room erupted. Several physicians spoke at once, their voices rising in indignation. How dare he suggest that bathing was safe? Had he not observed the clear connection between bathing and sickness? Did he not know of the countless cases where a bath had preceded the passing by mere days or weeks? My father rose to his feet. "Signore Guerini," he said, his voice cutting through the tumult, "I have practiced medicine for 37 years. In that time, I have seen dozens, perhaps hundreds, of cases where bathing preceded the onset of affliction. The connection is undeniable. The mechanism is clear. Warm water opens the pores, and through these opened gates, the corrupted air enters, bringing with it the seeds of sickness. This is not superstition. It is observable fact." Guerini met my father's gaze steadily. "With respect, doctor, you observe correlation, not causation. People bathe, yes, and sometimes they subsequently fall ill. But do they fall ill because they bathed? Or do they bathe and fall ill as separate events? In Padua, we have hospitals where patients are regularly washed, their bodies, their linens, their wounds, and we have found that these patients recover more readily than those left unwashed." "Hospital conditions," someone muttered, "are hardly comparable to everyday life." "Perhaps not," Guerini acknowledged, "but should we not at least question? Should we not observe and test rather than simply accepting ancient wisdom?" The gathering broke up shortly after, the physicians departing in states ranging from thoughtful to outraged. My father left without speaking to Guerini, and I followed dutifully behind. But I found myself thinking about the Italian's words, turning them over in my mind like strange coins from a foreign land. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed, I heard my father moving about downstairs in his study. When I rose and went to him, I found him poring over an ancient text, his candle burning low. "Father?" I said softly. He looked up, his face drawn. "I cannot sleep," he said. "That Italian." His words trouble me, not because they are persuasive, but because they are dangerous. If people believe that bathing is safe, they will bathe, and they will sicken, and they will pass into final rest, blaming us for not warning them properly. "But what if he is right?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. My father closed the book slowly. "Right?" he repeated. "Right. I have seen with these eyes the consequences of bathing. I have attended the sickbeds of those who thought themselves safe. I have recorded their passings. This is not theory, my son. This is experience." "But is experience always reliable?" I pressed. "Might we not see what we expect to see? If we believe bathing causes sickness, might we not notice every case that supports this belief while overlooking those that contradict it?" My father stared at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "You are young," he said. "You have not yet seen enough of affliction and passing to understand. But you will. Time will teach you what I cannot." He was right about one thing. Time would teach me, but not the lesson he anticipated. I began to keep records, not the usual notations of symptoms and treatments, but something more systematic. I noted every patient who came to us, and I noted their bathing habits, when they had last immersed themselves in water, how frequently they bathed, whether they bathed in hot or cold water, alone, or in company. I did this quietly, privately, writing in a journal I kept hidden even from my father. I was not entirely certain why I felt the need for such secrecy. Perhaps because I already suspected what my observations might reveal, and I feared the implications. The patterns that emerged were not what I had expected. Yes, there were cases where bathing seemed to precede affliction, but there were far more cases where it did not. I saw men and women who bathed regularly, every week, some of them, sometimes more frequently, who remained healthy year after year. I saw others who avoided water scrupulously, who wore the same unwashed garments for months, whose bodies accumulated layers of grime, who nevertheless fell victim to every passing ailment. More troublingly, I began to notice that those who came to us with infected wounds, with festering sores, with the putrid afflictions of the flesh, were almost invariably those who never washed. Their wounds were caked with filth, their bandages unchanged for weeks, their bodies host to vermin. And when we cleaned these wounds, as we sometimes did, despite our reluctance, the patients often improved. Could it be that Guarini was right? That cleanliness helped rather than harmed? I found myself troubled by questions that had no easy answers. If bathing was truly dangerous, why did it not kill more consistently? If open pores truly admitted affliction, why did some people with presumably open pores remain healthy? If the old wisdom was correct, why did the evidence seem so contradictory? I spoke of none of this to my father. Our relationship had grown strained since the incident with the Italian physician. He sensed, I think, that I was entertaining doubts, and this wounded him in ways he could not articulate. He had devoted his life to the practice of medicine as it had been taught to him, and to question that practice was, in his mind, to question the value of his entire life's work. But I could not stop questioning. Once begun, doubt is like water seeping through stone, slow, patient, inexorable. In the autumn of 1667, I had an opportunity to test my observations more directly. A family of German merchants had settled in Lyon, bringing with them their foreign customs, including regular bathing. The patriarch, Herr Zimmermann, engaged my father to serve as the family's physician. I accompanied my father on his first visit to their home. It was a fine house, newly built in a style that blended French and German elements. We were received warmly, offered wine and sweet cakes. Herr Zimmermann explained that he wished to establish a relationship with a local physician, as his wife was expecting their fourth child and they wanted assurance of proper care. As we toured the house, I noticed something unusual. There was a room, specially fitted, that contained a large wooden tub and an arrangement of pipes that could deliver heated water. A private bath chamber, in their own home. My father noticed it too. His face darkened. Herr Zimmermann, he said carefully, I must advise you that such facilities are considered dangerous here in France. The medical consensus is quite clear on the perils of frequent bathing. Zimmermann smiled politely. I appreciate your concern, Doctor. But in Germany, we have a different understanding. My family has bathed regularly for 3 generations, and we have enjoyed generally excellent health. I myself bathe twice weekly, my wife almost as frequently. We find it conducive to vigour and well-being. Twice weekly? My father's voice was strained. Herr Zimmermann, I must insist that you reconsider this practice. The danger is not merely theoretical. I have seen many cases where bathing preceded the onset of serious affliction. And I have seen cases, Zimmermann replied, his tone still courteous but firm, where the opposite appeared true. My mother, God rest her, lived to 83 years, bathing twice weekly until the very end. My children have thrived despite, or perhaps because of, regular washing. The conversation ended in an impasse. Zimmermann agreed to call upon us should any member of his family fall ill, but he would not promise to abandon his bathing practices. My father left the house in a state of agitation. They will sicken, he predicted grimly, and when they do, they will come to us for help. But by then, it will be too late. The damage will be done. But the Zimmermann family did not sicken. I saw them regularly over the following months, at church, at market, at various social gatherings. The children were robust and lively. Frau Zimmermann's pregnancy progressed normally. Herr Zimmermann himself appeared the picture of health. I began to visit them privately, ostensibly to check on Frau Zimmermann's condition, but in truth to observe. I asked them about their bathing practices, their diet, their daily routines. I examined the children, noting their clear skin, their bright eyes, their evident vitality. And I compared them in my mind to other families I knew, families who bathed perhaps once or twice a year, families whose children were sickly, whose adults suffered from persistent skin afflictions, whose homes smelled of accumulated unwashing. The comparison was troubling. The evidence of my own eyes contradicted everything I had been taught. In the winter of 1670, an event occurred that would permanently alter my understanding. My father, whose reputation had grown despite his advancing years, was summoned to Versailles. King Louis himself was indisposed, and additional physicians were being called to consult. It was a tremendous honour, and my father was permitted to bring me as his assistant. We travelled to Versailles in late January, when the roads were frozen and the sky hung low and grey. The palace, still under construction in many of its parts, was nonetheless magnificent beyond anything I had seen. We were received by the king's principal physician, a man named Vallo, who briefed us on His Majesty's condition. A persistent disorder of the digestion, Vallo explained, accompanied by headaches and a general malaise. His Majesty has been troubled by these symptoms for several weeks now. My father and I were permitted to observe as Valet and his team examined the king. Louis XIV, then 32 years old and at the height of his powers, nonetheless looked haggard and uncomfortable. The examination was thorough, involving inspection of the tongue, palpation of the abdomen, and careful questioning about symptoms. Afterwards, the physicians gathered in a private chamber to discuss the case. The theories proposed were various and contradictory: corrupted humours, an imbalance of bile, the unfavourable influence of Saturn, excessive consumption of rich foods. Then one of the younger physicians, a man named Daquin, spoke up. "Has consideration been given," he asked carefully, "to His Majesty's bathing practices?" A silence fell over the room. Vallo frowned. "What do you mean, precisely?" Daquin proceeded cautiously, clearly aware he was treading on dangerous ground. "It is known that His Majesty bathes with some frequency, more frequently than is customary. Might this not be a contributing factor?" Another physician, older and clearly of conservative disposition, nodded vigorously. "Indeed, the opening of the pores, the exposure to corrupted air whilst the body is vulnerable, these are well-established dangers." But Vallo shook his head. "Gentlemen, I must disagree. I have served His Majesty for many years now, and I have observed that his periods of good health often coincide with regular bathing, whilst his indispositions more commonly follow periods when he has refrained from washing due to cold weather or other circumstances." This observation was met with scepticism from many of the assembled physicians, but Vallo was insistent. "Consider," he said, "that His Majesty leads a life of extraordinary stress and activity. He works long hours, attends countless ceremonies, participates in hunts and military exercises. Is it not possible that cleanliness, the removal of accumulated perspiration and grime, contributes to his overall health rather than detracting from it?" The debate continued for some time, growing heated at points. My father listened but said little, his face troubled. I said nothing at all, being far too junior to speak in such august company. But I listened intently, absorbing every word. What struck me most was not the debate itself, but the underlying reality. Even here, among the most learned physicians in France, there was no consensus. The old certainties were crumbling, if slowly. Men who had been trained to believe one thing were beginning to see evidence that suggested another. That evening, after we had been dismissed for the day, I walked in the palace gardens despite the cold. The formal parterres were bare, the fountains stilled by frost, but the geometry of the place was magnificent even in winter. I found myself standing before the Bassin d'Apollon, looking at the frozen waters, thinking about everything I had heard and seen. An old man approached, walking slowly with the aid of a stick. He was plainly dressed, but carried himself with a certain dignity. We fell into conversation, as strangers sometimes do in such places. "You are one of the physicians," he observed, noting the bag I still carried. I acknowledged that I was, or at least training to be. "And what do you make of all this?" He gestured vaguely towards the palace. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. But there was something about the man, something that invited confidence. "I find myself troubled," I admitted. "Troubled by contradictions, by old wisdom that seems increasingly questionable, by evidence that suggests things are not as we have been taught." The old man nodded slowly. "Ah," he said, "you have encountered the most dangerous of all conditions, doubt." "Dangerous?" I repeated. "Oh, yes. Because once you begin to doubt one thing, you may begin to doubt everything. And where does that leave you? Adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no fixed point to guide you." He paused. "But perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing. Perhaps it is only by casting off from the familiar shore that we can discover new lands." "You sound," I said carefully, "as if you speak from experience." He smiled. "I am old enough to have seen many certainties crumble. I have lived through times when we believed things absolutely, only to discover we were absolutely wrong. The earth around which all else revolves? No, it revolves around the sun. The four humours that govern all health? Perhaps, perhaps not. The danger of bathing? Well, he shrugged. You are discovering that for yourself. But how do we know, I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. How do we distinguish between true knowledge and false belief, between wisdom and superstition? Observation, he said simply. Careful, systematic observation, uncoloured by preconception. It is harder than it sounds. We are all prone to seeing what we expect to see, to interpreting evidence in ways that confirm what we already believe. But if we can discipline ourselves to observe truly, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. He trailed off, looking up at the darkening sky. Then perhaps we can approach something like truth. We spoke a while longer, this old stranger and I, and then he took his leave. I never learned his name, never saw him again, but his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind like the voice of conscience. My father's health began to decline the following year. It started subtly, a persistent cough, a loss of appetite, a gradual diminishment of energy. He continued his practice, but with increasing difficulty. I found myself taking on more and more of his duties, seeing patients on my own, making decisions without his guidance. And in making these decisions, I found myself departing from his teachings. There was a woman, a widow named Madame Bertrand, who came to me with a festering wound on her leg. She had cut herself a month earlier, and the wound had not healed. Instead, it had become inflamed, swollen, painful to the touch. The flesh around it was red and hot, and there was a smell, the unmistakable sweet-rotten smell of putrefaction. I examined the wound carefully. It was caked with old, dried blood and other matter, crusted over but clearly infected beneath. Standard practice would have been to apply various poultices, bread and milk, egg white, honey, without cleaning the wound first. To clean it would be to open it further, to expose it to air, to risk spreading the infection. But I thought of the Zimmermans, of Guerini's words, of my own observations, and I made a decision that would have horrified my father. I cleaned the wound. I had water heated, not to boiling, but warm enough to be comfortable, and I washed away all the accumulated filth and crusted matter. I cleaned gently but thoroughly, until I could see the wound itself, the living tissue beneath the corruption. Madame Bertrand cried out at first, from pain and from shock. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "You are making it worse. The air will poison it." "Trust me," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "Please, trust me." When the wound was clean, I applied a simple bandage, nothing more. No elaborate poultice, no complicated mixture of ingredients. Just a clean cloth and instructions to wash the wound daily with warm water and to change the bandage often. "Daily?" She stared at me as if I had run mad. "You want me to wash it every day?" "Yes," I said firmly, "every day, and keep it clean. That is all." She left, clearly dubious, but she returned 2 days later, and then 2 days after that. Each time, I cleaned the wound again, and each time, I saw improvement. The redness began to recede, the swelling diminished. Fresh, healthy tissue started to appear at the edges. Within 2 weeks, the wound was healing properly. Within a month, it had closed completely. Madame Bertrand was effusive in her gratitude. "It is a miracle," she said. "My leg was turning black. I thought they would have to take it off. But you saved it." "Not a miracle," I replied. "Just cleanliness." But I did not tell my father what I had done. I did not tell him about the wound, about the washing, about the success. I knew what he would say, that I had been fortunate, that I had taken an unconscionable risk, that sooner or later such practices would lead to disaster, and perhaps he would have been right to worry. Because I did not stop with Madame Bertrand. I began to clean other wounds. I began to advise certain patients to wash more regularly. I began, very cautiously, to suggest that perhaps bathing was not as dangerous as commonly believed. Most patients resisted. The fear was too deep, too ingrained, but some listened, some tried, and those who did generally seemed better for it. My father discovered what I was doing in the autumn of 1672. A patient, I never learned who, mentioned to him that I had advised more frequent washing. That evening he confronted me in his study. He was angry, but behind the anger was something worse. Disappointment, hurt, a sense of betrayal. "You have been teaching contrary to everything I have taught you," he said. "You have been encouraging people to endanger themselves." "Father, No." He held up a hand. "I have heard the reports. I know what you have been doing. And I must tell you, as your father and as a physician, that you are wrong. Dangerously, recklessly wrong." "But I have seen improvement," I protested. "Wounds healing faster, patients recovering. Surely that counts for something." "You have seen what you wanted to see," he replied. "You have been influenced by that Italian and his modern notions. But modernness is not the same as correctness. The old wisdom has persisted for centuries because it is true, because it reflects observable reality." "Does it?" I asked. "Or does it persist because we are afraid to question it, because admitting we were wrong would be too painful?" My father's face went pale. For a long moment he said nothing. Then very quietly he spoke. "Get out. Father, get out of my sight. I cannot look at you now." I left his study, left the house, walked through the dark streets of Lyon with no destination in mind. I felt as if something had broken between us, something that could perhaps never be repaired. And yet, alongside the pain, I felt a strange relief. The secret was out. The break had come, and I could no longer hide behind obedience and filial duty. I would have to choose the old wisdom or the new understanding, my father's certainty or my own observations. The comfortable lie or the uncomfortable truth. In the summer of 1673, affliction returned to Lyon. It came from the south, carried by travellers from Marseille, where it had already struck with devastating force. This time, there was no denying what it was. This was the great visitor, the final shadow, the affliction that had haunted Europe for centuries. Plague, the word itself was enough to induce terror. I remember the day the first official case was confirmed. A silence seemed to fall over the city, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then came the noise, church bells tolling, people weeping, the rumble of carts as families who could afford to do so fled to the countryside. My father and I were reconciled after a fashion by necessity. When the final shadow comes, old quarrels seem petty and small. We work together as we had before, though there remained between us a coolness, a distance that had not been there in earlier years. The affliction spread quickly. Within 2 weeks there were hundreds of cases, within a month thousands. The authorities attempted to impose quarantine measures, but they were largely ineffective. The affliction moved through the city like fire through dry grass, consuming all in its path. And in the midst of this catastrophe, the old beliefs about bathing intensified. People were terrified of water, convinced that washing would open their bodies to the pestilence. The few public bathhouses that remained were shut down by official decree. Notices were posted throughout the city warning against bathing, against swimming in the river, against any immersion in water. I remember one such notice, nailed to the door of the Church of Saint-Jean. It read, "Let no person wash the body entire, for such washing opens the gates of the flesh and admits the pestilence. Let all persons remain as they are, adding layers of clothing against the corrupted air and trusting in God's mercy for deliverance." The result was a city of unwashed people, their bodies layered with grime and sweat, their clothing unchanged for weeks or months, living in close quarters in houses shuttered against the supposedly corrupted outside air. The smell was indescribable, and the pestilence raged on, unabated by their precautions. I saw things during that summer that I shall never forget. I saw entire families struck down, lying together in their beds, too weak to rise, waiting for the final rest. I saw streets emptied of life, doors marked with crosses to indicate the presence of affliction within. I saw carts piled with the departed, trundling through the streets at dusk, their drivers wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar, their faces hidden behind beaked masks, filled with aromatic herbs. And I saw something else, something that troubled me deeply. Those who survived longest, who seemed most resistant to the affliction, were not those who followed the old prescriptions most carefully. They were not the most fastidious avoiders of water, the most devoted adherents to ancient wisdom. They were, rather, those who maintained some measure of cleanliness despite the prevailing fear. those who washed their hands, who changed their clothing, who kept their dwellings as clean as circumstances permitted. I began to notice a pattern in houses where the affliction had struck, where some members of the family had fallen whilst others remained healthy. The survivors were often those who had, for whatever reason, maintained better cleanliness. A woman who insisted on washing her hands before preparing food. A man who changed his shirt regularly, despite social disapproval. Children whose mother still washed them, believing maternal instinct over medical advice. The correlation was not perfect. Many clean people died. Many filthy people survived. But the trend was there, visible to anyone willing to see it. I tried to speak of this to my father. We were sitting in his study late one night, both of us exhausted from the day's labours. The candle burned low between us, casting shadows that flickered across his worn face. "Father," I said carefully, "have you noticed that those who maintain cleanliness seem to fare somewhat better in this affliction?" He looked at me wearily. "I have noticed," he replied, "that the pestilence strikes where it will, with no pattern that human understanding can discern. I have seen the most pious struck down and the most wicked spared. I have seen the rich and the poor, the clean and the dirty, all falling equally before this scourge." "But surely there must be some pattern," I insisted. "Some reason why some survive and others do not." "The reason," my father said firmly, "is the will of Providence. The pestilence is a judgment, a cleansing of the world's corruption. Those who pass into final rest do so because it is their time. Those who survive do so because they are spared, for some purpose we cannot know." "But what if it is not Providence?" I asked. "What if there is a natural explanation? What if the pestilence spreads through contact, through proximity to the afflicted? And what if cleanliness, proper cleanliness, including washing, helps to prevent this spread?" My father shook his head slowly. "You cling to these notions despite all evidence. Look around you. The city is full of people who have avoided bathing, who have followed every traditional precaution, and still they sicken and pass into final rest. How do you explain that?" "Because avoiding bathing is not enough," I said. "Because there are other forms of cleanliness that matter. Washing hands, changing clothing, cleaning living spaces. These things matter, Father. I have seen it." "You have seen what you wish to see," he replied, and there was an infinite sadness in his voice. "Just as I see what I have been taught to see." We are both prisoners of our own perspectives, unable to perceive the truth that lies beyond them. It was the most honest exchange we had had in months, and it left me feeling simultaneously closer to him and more distant than ever. In September of that year, I was assigned to work at the Hôtel Dieu, the great hospital of Lyon. It was overwhelmed with victims of the pestilence, far beyond its capacity to care for them properly. I was needed there, and though I feared for my life, I could not refuse. The hospital was a vision of suffering beyond anything I had previously witnessed. The sick lay 2 or 3 to a bed, some already in the final stages of passing, others newly arrived and still hopeful of recovery. The air was thick with the smell of illness, of unwashed bodies, of the final rest itself. I was assigned to a ward on the upper floor where perhaps 60 patients were crowded into a space meant for 30. There was one other physician, a man named Reynaud, who had been working in the hospital for weeks already. He looked like he had aged a decade in that time, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "The key to survival here," he told me on my first day, "is to maintain distance. Touch the patients as little as possible. Breathe through cloth soaked in vinegar. Wash your hands with vinegar after every contact. And above all, do not bathe. Do not open your pores to the corruption that fills this place." I followed his advice for the first few days, though it troubled me. The patients were suffering, and our reluctance to touch them, to properly clean their wounds and sores, seemed to add to their suffering rather than alleviate it. Then something happened that changed everything. A young woman was brought in, perhaps 20 years old, in the early stages of the affliction. She had the fever, the headache, the beginning of the swellings, but she was still conscious, still capable of speech. And she was filthy, her hair matted with grime, her clothing stiff with accumulated dirt, her skin bearing the marks of weeks without washing. I looked at her condition, and I made a decision. I ordered hot water brought up. I gathered clean linens. And despite Reno's protests, despite the disapproving looks of the other attendants, I began to wash her. I washed her hair first, carefully, gently, working out the tangles and the accumulated filth, then her face, her neck, her arms. I had her clothing removed and replaced with a clean shift. I washed her feet between her toes, removing the layers of dirt that had accumulated there. The young woman wept as I worked, but not from pain. "No one has touched me with kindness in so long," she whispered. "Everyone fears me. Everyone pulls away. But you are washing me as if I were a person, not a thing to be avoided." "You are a person," I replied. "You are not merely your affliction." When I had finished, she lay back against the clean linens, her hair damp but clean, her skin scrubbed and pink. She looked more human, more alive than she had when she arrived. Reno confronted me afterwards. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You have exposed yourself to the pestilence directly. You have opened your own pores with the warm water and steam. You have touched her body, her clothing, her corruption. You will sicken now. You will pass into final rest, and it will be your own fault." "Perhaps," I said, "but I do not think so." And I did not sicken. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks. I continued to work in the hospital, and I continued to wash patients when possible. Not all of them. There were too many, and resources were limited, but those for whom I could make time. And I noticed something remarkable. The patients I washed seemed to fare better than those I did not. Oh, many still died. The pestilence was deadly, and no amount of washing could save everyone. But some recovered, and those who recovered were disproportionately those I had cleaned. Moreover, the wounds and sores that often accompanied the pestilence, the terrible buboes, the lesions, the weeping ulcers, these healed faster when kept clean. When washed daily, when treated with clean bandages, they suppurated less, smelled less foul, and more often resolved without the gangrene that claimed so many. I began to keep meticulous records, noting which patients were washed and how frequently, what their symptoms were, and what the outcomes were. The pattern became increasingly clear. Cleanliness helped. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than not. Other physicians in the hospital noticed what I was doing. Some were horrified, convinced I was hastening both my own final rest and that of my patients. But others, particularly the younger ones, began to question, began to observe, began tentatively to imitate my practices, and they too found that they did not sicken, that their patients seemed to benefit, that perhaps the old wisdom was not so wise after all. My father died in October of 1673, not from the pestilence, ironically, but from a general failure of his body worn down by age and overwork. I was not with him when he passed into final rest. I was at the hospital, washing the fevered body of a merchant's son, trying to bring some comfort to the dying. When word reached me, I left immediately. I ran through the streets of Lyon, past the shuttered houses and the marked doors, past the carts of the departed and the weeping families, ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. But I was too late. He had already gone, lying peacefully in his bed, his worn medical text stacked on the table beside him. His hands were folded across his chest, and there was an expression on his face that might have been peace or might have been resignation. I knelt beside his bed and wept, not just for him, but for everything we had left unsaid between us. For all the arguments we had had, all the coldness and distance of our final years together, for the fact that he had died, still believing things I now knew to be false, still certain of a wisdom that was no wisdom at all. The priest came and administered the last rites, though my father was beyond hearing them. The neighbours came to pay their respects, speaking in hushed tones about what a learned man he had been, how many people he had helped, how he had devoted his life to the service of others. All of this was true. My father had been a good man, a dedicated physician, a devoted parent. But he had also been wrong. Wrong about bathing, wrong about cleanliness, wrong about the mechanisms by which affliction spread. And his wrongness had, I believed, contributed to countless passings that might have been prevented. How do we reconcile this? How do we honour someone whose dedication was admirable, but whose beliefs were mistaken? How do we acknowledge both the good they did and the harm that came from their errors? I have pondered these questions for all the years since, and I still have no satisfactory answer. We buried my father 3 days later in the cemetery of St. Paul under a sky heavy with autumn rain. The gravedigger worked quickly, nervous about contagion despite the fact that my father had not died of pestilence. Fear had made everyone jumpy, suspicious, ready to see danger in every shadow. After the burial, I returned to our house, now my house alone. I stood in my father's study, surrounded by his books and instruments, his notes and records accumulated over decades of practice, and I made a decision. I would continue his work, but I would do it differently. I would observe without preconception. I would test rather than assume. I would follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it contradicted everything I had been taught. I would, in short, become the physician my father had raised me to be, even if it meant rejecting much of what he had taught me. The pestilence began to wane as winter approached. Whether this was due to the cold weather, to the natural progression of such afflictions, or to some other cause, none could say with certainty. But the number of new cases declined, the daily death toll decreased, and slowly, cautiously, the city began to breathe again. I continued my work at the Hôtel Dieu through the winter and into the spring of 1674, and I continued my observations, my record-keeping, my careful documentation of what worked and what did not. The patterns became increasingly undeniable. Patients who were kept clean, whose wounds were washed regularly, whose linens were changed frequently, fared better than those left in their own filth. The difference was not absolute. Some clean patients died, some dirty patients survived, but it was statistically significant. Moreover, I noticed that those of us who maintained cleanliness in our own persons, who washed our hands frequently, who changed our clothing regularly, were less likely to contract the pestilence ourselves. Again, the protection was not perfect. Some careful physicians sickened and died, but the trend was clear. I began to formulate a theory. What if the pestilence was spread not through corrupted air, not through evil humours or unfavourable planetary alignments, but through direct contact, through some invisible substance that passed from the sick to the healthy, that adhered to skin and clothing, that could be washed away with water. It was a radical notion, one that contradicted centuries of medical wisdom, but it fit the observations better than any other explanation. I began to write up my findings, working late into the night by candlelight, trying to express clearly and logically what I had observed. I wrote carefully, knowing that what I was proposing would be controversial, that many would reject it out of hand, but I also wrote with a growing sense of conviction. This was important. This was truth, or as close to truth as human understanding could come, and it needed to be shared no matter the resistance it might encounter. In the spring of 1674, I presented my findings to a gathering of Lyon's medical community. It was a small group. The pestilence had taken many physicians, and others had fled the city and not yet returned. But those who remained listened as I laid out my evidence. I spoke of the patients I had treated, the outcomes I had observed. I presented my records, my careful documentation of who had been washed, and with what frequency, what their symptoms had been, how they had fared. I proposed my theory of contact transmission, of cleanliness as a protective measure. The response was mixed. Some physicians were intrigued, asking probing questions, wanting to know more. Others were openly skeptical, pointing to cases that seemed to contradict my findings, questioning my methods, suggesting that I was seeing patterns where none existed. But the most hostile response came from the older physicians, those who had studied longest under the old system. They saw my work not as new knowledge, but as dangerous heresy, as an attack on the wisdom of the ancients, as youthful arrogance dressed up as scientific inquiry. "You would overturn Galen," one of them demanded. "You would reject the accumulated wisdom of 14 centuries based on a few months of observation." "I would follow the evidence," I replied. "I would observe what actually happens, rather than what we believe should happen." "The evidence," another physician retorted, "is that we have avoided bathing for generations, and humanity has survived. If bathing were truly beneficial, would not the ancients have known it? Would not Hippocrates and Galen have recommended it?" The ancients, I said carefully, were working with the knowledge available to them. They observed, they theorized, They did the best they could with what they knew. But knowledge advances, understanding grows. We can honour the ancients whilst also recognising that they were sometimes mistaken. The debate continued for hours, growing heated at times. No consensus was reached. The meeting ended with the physicians as divided as they had been at the start. But seeds had been planted, questions had been raised, and I knew, even if others did not yet, that the old certainties were crumbling. The years that followed were years of gradual change, not sudden revolution, but slow, grudging acceptance of new ideas. It happened person by person, case by case, observation by observation. I continued my practice, now as an independent physician, no longer in my father's shadow. I continued to recommend regular washing, to clean wounds thoroughly, to maintain cleanliness in my own person and in the treatment of my patients. And my practice grew because people noticed that my patients tended to fare better than those of more traditional physicians. Other physicians began to adopt similar practices, particularly the younger ones. They had seen what I had seen during the pestilence. They had observed the same patterns, drawn the same conclusions, and they were less invested in defending the old wisdom, less threatened by the suggestion that it might be flawed. The Zimmermans, the German family who had bathed regularly despite all warnings, became something of a sensation. They had survived the pestilence intact, all of them, from Herr Zimmermann down to the youngest child. And people noticed. If bathing was so dangerous, why had the most devoted bathers survived when so many who avoided water had perished? Slowly, very slowly, attitudes began to shift. People began to bathe more frequently, though still with trepidation. Physicians began to recommend cleanliness, though often in veiled language, not wanting to seem too radical. Public bathhouses began to reopen, though they now emphasized cleanliness and individual tubs rather than communal bathing. The process was frustratingly gradual. Old beliefs die hard, particularly when they are bound up with identity, with tradition, with the teachings of respected authorities. Many people continued to fear bathing, continued to avoid water, continued to believe that cleanliness was dangerous. But the direction of change was clear. The old wisdom was slowly giving way to new understanding. The age of fear was ending, though its final rest would take generations. In the summer of 1680, Tommaso Guerini returned to Lyon. He was older now, greyer, but still possessed of that intensity I remembered from our first meeting 15 years earlier. He had heard of my work during the pestilence, of my findings regarding cleanliness and affliction, and he sought me out. We met in a tavern near the river, in a private room where we could speak freely. He embraced me like an old friend, though we had met only briefly before. "I knew," he said, his eyes bright with vindication, "when I spoke all those years ago, when I told your medical society that cleanliness was beneficial, I knew I was right, but I could not prove it as you have done. I did not have the evidence, the careful observations, the documentation. You have done what I could not." I felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride certainly, but also sadness. "Many died," I said quietly, "who might have lived if we had understood sooner, if we had been willing to question sooner." "That is always the way," Guerini replied. "Knowledge advances over the bodies of those who died in ignorance. It is a harsh truth, but truth nonetheless. We cannot change the past. We can only learn from it and try to ensure fewer die in the future." We spent hours in conversation, sharing our observations, our theories, our frustrations with the slow pace of change. Guerini told me of developments in Italy, where new ideas about anatomy and physiology were challenging ancient doctrines. He spoke of Malpighi and his microscope, of Leeuwenhoek and his tiny animalcules, of Hooke and his observations of the minute structures of living things. "We are living," he said, "in a time of transformation. The old world of received wisdom is dying, and a new world of observation and experiment is being born. It is painful, this birth. There is resistance, fear, anger, but it cannot be stopped. Truth has its own momentum." "Do you think," I asked him, "that people will look back on this time and wonder how we could have been so wrong, how we could have feared something as simple as bathing?" Guerini smiled. "Oh, certainly. Future generations will shake their heads at our ignorance, at our superstitions, at our resistance to obvious truths, just as we now shake our heads at beliefs of earlier times, that the earth is flat, that the sun revolves around us, that disease is caused by evil spirits. Each generation thinks itself enlightened and its predecessors benighted, and each generation is partly right. Only partly? I asked. Only partly, he confirmed, because each generation also clings to its own false beliefs, its own unexamined assumptions. We mock the past for fearing bathing, but what do we fear that future generations will find equally absurd? What are we certain of now that will prove to be mistaken? It was a sobering thought, one that has stayed with me through all the years since. We are all, to some degree, prisoners of our time, unable to see beyond the horizons of current understanding. The best we can do is to question, to observe, to remain open to the possibility that we might be wrong. I am writing this now in the year 1716. The 17th century, with all its fears and superstitions, has passed into history. A new century has dawned, one that promises to be more enlightened, more rational, more scientific. Bathing is no longer widely feared, at least not in the way it once was. People wash regularly. Public bathhouses are commonplace. Physicians recommend cleanliness as a basic principle of health. The change has not been complete. There are still those who cling to the old beliefs, still regions where fear of water persists. But the direction is clear, and yet I find myself troubled. Because whilst we have overcome one false belief, we have undoubtedly embraced others. Whilst we have learned one truth, we remain ignorant of countless others. We have taken one step forward, but the journey is far from over. I think often of my father, of his certainty, his devotion to what he believed was right. He was wrong, but he was wrong in good faith, practicing medicine as it had been taught to him, doing his best with the knowledge available. Can I fault him for that? Can any of us be blamed for not knowing what we have not yet learned? And yet, the cost of his wrongness was real. People suffered, people died, people lived in unnecessary fear because of beliefs that were false. Good intentions do not erase harmful consequences. This is the paradox I have wrestled with all my life. How to honour the past whilst also acknowledging its errors. How to respect our teachers whilst also surpassing them. How to be humble about our own limitations whilst also being confident enough to challenge received wisdom. I have no easy answers. I know only that we must continue to question, to observe, to test our beliefs against reality. We must be willing to be wrong, willing to change our minds, willing to abandon cherished ideas when the evidence demands it. Would you have had the courage to do so? Would you have been willing to question what everyone around you believed to be true? Would you have risked ridicule, professional ruin, social ostracism to follow where the evidence led? It is easy, from a distance of years or centuries, to judge those who clung to false beliefs. It is much harder to recognize and abandon our own false beliefs in the present moment. I am an old man now, my hands gnarled with age, my body stooped and weak. I have lived long enough to see the world transform, to see beliefs I once held as sacred revealed as superstition, to see practices I once thought dangerous recognized as beneficial. And I have learned this, that the human mind is a curious thing, capable of both remarkable insight and profound self-deception. We see what we expect to see. We interpret evidence to fit our preconceptions. We resist change even when change would benefit us, because the familiar, even when harmful, feels safer than the unknown. The fear of bathing was not merely ignorance, it was a worldview, a way of understanding the body and its relationship to the environment. It was bound up with ideas about purity and pollution, about the body as a fortress that must be defended, about the dangers lurking in the world around us. And in some ways these fears were not entirely unfounded. The world was dangerous. Disease did lurk unseen. The body was vulnerable. Our ancestors were not fools for being afraid. But they were wrong about the specifics. Water did not cause disease by opening the pores. Bathing did not invite affliction. Cleanliness was protective, not dangerous. The tragedy is that we could have learned this sooner. The evidence was there, had anyone been willing to see it. The Italians knew it. Some practical people, unencumbered by medical theory, knew it instinctively, but formal medicine, with all its learning and authority, clung to falsehood for centuries. Why? Because changing one's mind is hard. Because admitting error is painful. Because the entire structure of medical authority rested on the presumed correctness of ancient wisdom, and to question that wisdom was to question the foundation of the profession itself. I understand this now in a way I could not when I was young. I understand why my father resisted my observations, why he could not bring himself to accept that what he had believed and taught for decades was false. It would have meant confronting the possibility that his life's work had been built on error, that patients he had failed to save might have lived if he had understood differently. That is a heavy burden to bear. Perhaps too heavy for any person to carry while still maintaining the confidence needed to practice medicine at all. What have we learned, we who lived through the age of fear? What can we pass on to those who come after? First, that observation matters more than authority, that what we see with our own eyes counts for more than what we read in ancient texts, no matter how revered those texts might be. That experience, carefully documented and honestly reported, is the foundation of genuine knowledge. Second, that changing our minds is not weakness but strength, that admitting we were wrong is not shameful but necessary, that clinging to false beliefs out of pride or tradition or comfort does not serve us or those we seek to help. Third, that fear is a poor guide to truth, that what terrifies us is not necessarily dangerous, and what seems safe may harbour unseen risks, that we must examine our fears, question their origins, test them against reality. Fourth, that progress is slow and hard-won, that false beliefs persist, not because people are stupid, but because change is difficult, because the familiar feels safe, because questioning what everyone believes requires courage that not everyone possesses. And fifth, that every generation believes itself enlightened whilst remaining blind to its own errors. That we who now mock our ancestors for fearing bathing are undoubtedly clinging to our own false beliefs, which future generations will find equally absurd. This is the wisdom of age, not certainty, but awareness of uncertainty, not the possession of truth, but the recognition that truth is always partial, always evolving, always one step beyond our current understanding. I write these final words in my 73rd year, looking back across a life that has spanned from the age of fear to the age of reason, or at least the beginning of such an age. I have seen beliefs transform, practices change, the impossible become commonplace. And I think about water, simple water, that substance that covers most of our world, that makes up most of our bodies, that is essential to all life. How strange that we once feared it. How peculiar that we believed it could harm us, when in fact it cleanses, refreshes, heals. But perhaps not so strange, in the end, because water is powerful. It can erode stone, flood cities, drown the unwary. Our ancestors were right to respect it, even if they misunderstood the nature of its dangers. And perhaps there is a lesson here, one that extends beyond bathing and hygiene to all of human knowledge. Perhaps every great fear contains a kernel of legitimate concern, even when the specific beliefs that grow from that concern are false. Perhaps every superstition begins with observation, even if the interpretation of that observation proves mistaken. Our task, then, is not to mock the past for its errors, but to learn from them, to understand how intelligent, educated, well-meaning people could have believed things that now seem obviously false, and then to turn that understanding on ourselves, on our own beliefs and assumptions, and ask, what are we certain of now that will prove to be wrong? What do we fear that is harmless? What do we trust that is dangerous? I have no crystal sphere to see the future. I do not know what future generations will think when they read this account, if, indeed, anyone ever does read it. Perhaps they will shake their heads at our ignorance, as we shake our heads at the ignorance of those who came before us. Perhaps they will wonder how we could have been so blind to truths that seem obvious to them. But I hope they will also understand that we did the best we could with what we knew, that we questioned when questioning was difficult, that we changed our minds when change was painful, that we moved, however slowly, toward greater understanding, and I hope they will remember that they too are limited by the knowledge of their time, that they too cling to beliefs that will prove false, that they too must have the courage to question, to observe, to change. The water flows on, as it always has, indifferent to our fears and theories. It washes away the grime of ages, reveals what lies beneath, cleanses and renews, and we, at last, have learned to let it do its work. That is something, at least. That is progress, however long in coming. I set down my pen now, as the light fades and my old eyes grow tired. The ink is dry upon the page, the words are fixed, the testimony is complete. Let those who come after judge whether it was worth the telling. But I know this. It was worth the living. Every question asked, every observation made, every belief challenged, every mind changed. The journey from fear to understanding, though painful and slow, was worth every step. Would you have made the same journey, given the chance? Would you have questioned what everyone believed? Would you have followed the evidence even when it led away from comfort and certainty? I hope so, because that is how we move forward. That is how we leave the darkness behind. That is how we become, generation by generation, a little less ignorant, a little less afraid, a little more capable of seeing the world as it truly is. The water knows. It has always known. And now, at last, we know as well. Thus ends this account, written in Lyon in the year of our Lord 1716, by one who witnessed the age when water was feared and lived to see that fear diminish. May those who read it learn what I learned, painfully and slowly, that truth matters more than tradition, that observation matters more than authority, and that changing one's mind is not defeat, but the only path to wisdom.